So often I think we still have this instinct as Democrats, horrified by the abuses and the failures in the character of this presidency, that there will be some kind of piece of evidence out there that demonstrates conclusively to everybody that he's not a good guy. And what I hope we can remember is that there are a lot of people, certainly in the industrial Midwest where I live, who already know that he's not a good guy. They didn't vote for him because they think he's a good guy. They voted for him for a whole different set of reasons. And this isn't going to change that.
Serious and sober commentary from a candidate who's being taken very seriously in all corners these days. But 3 months ago, he was a relative unknown, at least outside South Bend, Indiana. Now Mayor Pete is challenging the top tier of the 2020 Democratic contenders, and this might be why. From New York Magazine, quote, sick of old people? He looks like Alex P. Keaton. Scared of young people? He looks like Alex P. Keaton. Religious? He's Christian. Atheist? He's not weird about it. Wary of Washington? He's from flyover country. Horrified by flyover country? He has degrees from Harvard and Oxford. Traditional? He's married. Woke? He's gay. Way behind the rest of the country on that? He's not too gay. Worried about socialism? He's a technocratic capitalist. If you squint hard enough to not see color, some people say, you can almost see Obama in The Inspiring Professor. Oh, and he's the son of an immigrant, a Navy vet, speaks 7 foreign languages, owns 2 rescue dogs, and plays the piano. He's actually terrifying. What mother wouldn't love this guy? The Buttigieg campaign appears ready to test that theory by throwing him right into the deep end. NBC News today confirmed an earlier report from The Hill that Mayor Pete's team is in talks with Fox News to do a televised town hall. Joining our conversation, MSNBC contributor Sam Stein, politics editor for The Daily Beast, and Anna Palmer, senior Washington correspondent for Politico and co-author of the killer new book that everybody's talking about. I never thought I'd quote Donald Trump. Everybody's talking about it. The Hill to Die On. Let me start with you. I will confess, I went into the green room and said, well, we covering the right to political stories, and we paying too much attention to Buttigieg. I mean, I've fallen for him, and I've confessed my political crush. But he does seem to rise to every occasion. I mean, being interviewed by Rachel Maddow, it has become a rite of passage, and he just manages to turn every moment into one that people talk about for a couple of news cycles.
He has an authenticity that I think is missing in a lot of the other candidates so far. He's pretty open about things that oftentimes Democrats don't want to talk about. Religion, you know, where he is in terms of being a mayor of a flyover country, as you said. I think that he is catching momentum. Now the question is, can he sustain that?
Do you think that the early buzz has ruined more candidacies or catapulted more candidacies? If you just look back at the last 3 or 4 cycles.
If you look at history, there are candidates like Gary Hart and Howard Dean who have struggled when they've become a favorite in the Democratic presidential primary. Yeah. Others, like Jimmy Carter in 1976, were able to run as an outsider, someone Washington didn't know, and actually win the nomination and win the White House. It is still very early, as Anna said, to judge how Mayor Buttigieg's campaign is going to evolve. But having covered him in South Bend over the weekend, you see this is someone who is struggling right now to escalate his whole operation. He needs to build a finance operation, early state operation. But so far, this is a candidate who has found his message, and he continues to do a media tour, which, as President Trump showed us all in 2016, this new day and age of politics is not so much about traditional advertising and structure. That matters, especially in places like South Carolina, where he's maybe not as well known. But at this point in the cycle, you have to win people's attention and keep their attention, and he's doing that for the moment.
Can I challenge him on the idea that what he has to do next is build these operations? I mean, Trump never had those. He and Hope Hicks and Corey, and then Corey left, and Paul Manafort double-dutied for the oligarchs and Trump. And I mean, Trump never had any of those things. He's the president. Who's holding him to that standard to have early organization?
I would just only push back on that. Look at Senator Sanders' experience in 2016. He's learned a few things about his own delegate operation. In the Democratic primary, you can't just be a movement. You have to prepare in a crowded field for a potential contested convention. And so Buttigieg has a movement that's growing, certainly online, in certain areas of the party. But if he doesn't have a delegate operation on the ground, should this be a protracted primary fight, he will find himself, just like Senator Sanders did in 2016, wishing he did more to organize.
It's a great point. You could have a movement without a candidate, and that's manifested manifesting itself in all the friction between Sanders and a lot of the other people in the field. Where do you see this? I mean, it is a movement. Where do you see the Mayor Pete movement?
Well, to Robert's point, if you look back at 2008, which seems to be the template we're judging Mayor Pete on, and you look at what Obama did, he burst out of the gates, amazing first quarter fundraising number. But underneath it all was a very business-like operation that was all about delegate counting.
It was both,
and in Nevada specifically, I remember this, he lost to Hillary Clinton in the popular vote in the primary, but that evening his campaign team got on a call to reporters and said, we got more delegates. And they had managed to figure out how to win the actual primary, which matters. And so for Mayor Pete...
It was like Bush in 2000. I think he lost Michigan, and they got on the phone with reporters, and they went back and won California or something.
Mayor Pete taking this enthusiasm that he's obviously encountered and turning it into an actual operation is vital. The good news that he has is two things. One, he's spending very little money and raising a decent amount, and that will only continue as his name ID goes up. And two is he's learned a very valuable lesson from Donald Trump, and I'm not original in this observation, which is all media essentially is good media. There is not a hit that Mayor Pete has turned down at this juncture. And he's used that to his advantage. He's very capable at doing these interviews, and he's becoming ubiquitous in the press. And that has raised his profile. It's helped his fundraising operation. It's put him into this first tier of Democratic candidates. I don't know if there's an oversaturation risk, but at this point, they're willing to run it.
And he's compelling. Let's watch.
One of the risks that I think people with meaningful jobs have, especially people in politics actually, is because your job is meaningful, a lot of the meaning in your life comes from your job, which is a real problem because part of what is needed, I think, to be good at your job in politics is to have something worth more to you than winning. You know, you have to be ready to walk away from that job in order to deserve it. But I did get a lot of meaning from that work. And in some ways, because it was so demanding, I almost didn't mind for an inordinately long time that I didn't have much of a personal life. And I did not have a dating life while I was closeted or anything like that. The city was a jealous bride for a long time and kept me busy, but it was really the deployment that put me over the top. I realized that you only get to be one person. You don't know how long you have on this earth. And by the time I came back, I realized, like, I gotta do something.
That was Mayor Pete and Rachel talking about coming out. They both talked openly about that and what it was like in their lives. Something you do. This is not our parents' or our grandparents' presidential primary.
To say the least. I mean, it also just shows where the country is and how quickly things have shifted on this issue. But to your point earlier, I also think it's going to be really interesting to see how do the other candidates in this field deal with this, because so far he's doing all of this media and he handles it so well. And he talks about, even when he was talking about his health, there was a package earlier this week on MSNBC, and he was talking about mental health. That was the first thing he wanted. So he's willing to take on these topics that most candidates aren't, and you don't see the other senators who are struggling in this race, who are candidates, doing the same thing.
There's a great story in the New York Times a couple days ago about how he diagnosed one of the problems or challenges the Democratic Party had, a problem with their narrative. And you and I both spent our careers in the press shops of the various people we worked for. I mean, there is a deficit on both sides of the aisle. I would argue more in the Republican Party, but he is approaching this primary as a storyteller.
Yeah, when I watch him, I keep thinking about that Mario Cuomo line that you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. I mean, that's what he's doing. He is telling a story. And the reason that's so attractive, he tells a story not just about policies, but about where the country stands, kind of in the arc of history, where we stand, where the Midwest stands with deindustrialization, and offering a response to that isn't rooted in nativism that you see from the president, and isn't just kind of a dry policy proposal, though you have to have those as well undergirding what you say, but it's not just policy proposals. He has a story to tell to the American public. And, you know, if I were a campaign manager and I had to choose between an extremely talented candidate with a message for the American public, but with no operation, and an operation with a candidate that's dry and boring, you would always take the former, because you can build the ladder. You can hire people to build a fundraising operation, a field operation, a delegate tracking operation. And he's got a lot of time to do that. And you know, if he continues to raise money like he is, he's going to have all the resources to do it as well.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.